Hello, everybody. Warm welcome to you all. I'm Doris Epstein, co-chair of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, CIJR. The academic year has begun, but instead of the pursuit of knowledge, civic-mindedness, and excellence, many universities think it's the role of education to provide a certain idea of social justice activism. The academic credibility of universities is being questioned as classical liberal values have been replaced by wokeism. In this, the first webinar of our series about the current state of academia, prominent anthropologist and author, Professor Elizabeth White, will talk about what happened to her when her scientific research was canceled because it conflicted with the prevailing woke ideology and what she's doing about it. Dr. Weiss is a professor emeritus of anthropology at San Jose University and the author of numerous books and articles. Bernard Bobo, a history doctoral student at the University of Quebec and Montreal, and CIJR fellow, will interview her. First, a big thanks to our fellow community sponsors. Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, and Jew Hatred, the Lodger Center Congregation, Tough Think, and One Global Voice. CIJR, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, began in Montreal over 35 years ago. A group of professors headed by Professor Fred Krantz were seeing soaring anti-Semitism on Montreal campuses. They began organizing speakers, publications, conferences, everything they could do to combat the misinformation and bias against Israel and the Jewish people. A goal that unfortunately, sadly, continues to this very day and with even greater urgency. Through CIJR's publications, such as the Daily Briefing, you can depend on in-depth, fact-based analyses of Israel, Jewish culture, world politics. You'll find information and news, I promise you, that you'll never find on mainstream media. Keep in mind, though, CIJR is a not-for-profit organization whose valuable work for students and for Israel is entirely dependent on tax-free donations. And now, get ready. Elizabeth Weiss, Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, it's your floor.
Thank you so much for having me on here. And if I could have the first slide, that would be great. I'm going to start a little bit with an introduction about who I am and what I did and how the wokeism in anthropology and in academia in general has kind of derailed my career. I'm an anthropologist, a physical anthropologist, which means that I study skeletal remains, mainly of past peoples and mainly of Native American past peoples, but I have done research on other collections such as Quebecois prisoners of war from 1700s and also from Carthage, Tunisia, 5th to 7th century AD. My job as an anthropologist is to reconstruct past lives, to see what people died of, what their lives were like. And to do that, also to make connections to the present, whether it's to try to better understand bone biology or to see how things have changed and what has stayed the same. In some ways, this helps us understand what is cultural and what is biological, such as sex differences that are biological versus differences between males and females, which change from one generation to another or from one place to another. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. I started at San Jose State in 2004 after I did a postdoc at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And it was my dream job to be at San Jose State University because when I was hired, they asked me, "What do you need to have a great career? You know, what what resources do you need?" And I said, "Really, the only thing I need is a great skeletal collection." And San Jose State had a great skeletal collection, a prehistoric Native American collection that was all pre-European contact, that was from a single site, the largest collection west of the Mississippi from a single site. And so I built my career on this collection. In 2020, I had my book published, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, where I voiced my opinion with my co-author, where we wrote about the problems facing anthropology in regards to the reburial of skeletal remains. Now, even before I was hired at San Jose State, I was worried about reburial laws, both in Canada and in the US. In the US, the main law is a federal law, it's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. But when I was doing data collection for my postdoc and my PhD, which I did at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, there were already reburials occurring at the museum. And I was concerned that these reburials would basically hinder our ability to reconstruct the past. And I had written about these issues from the get-go. So everybody knew my position. It wasn't a surprise. But in 2020, when my book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which I co-authored with Jim Springer, came out, there was a huge storm about it and a campaign to try to ban the book, to literally get the publishers to depublish the book, hit the academic grapevine, so to speak. And they had an open letter in anthropology, various university professors got together and wrote an open letter to the publisher arguing that the book should be pulled. That letter garnered 900 signatures, mainly from professors and graduate students. Now, one of the interesting things about the book is that we were trying to understand not only the law, and Jim Springer, my co-author, did the deep dive into the reburial laws, but we are also trying to understand the ideology, what we called repatriation ideology. And what we noticed was this ideology was a sliver of postmodern ideology and fit into the woke ideology. And that is that it does not matter who is telling the right story or the accurate story of the America's past. What matters is who the narrator is. And if that narrator has victim status or has been seen to be oppressed, then we should believe that narrative regardless of its validity. And in anthropology, what this means is that Native Americans have been able to stop scientific research by claiming that remains as old as 14,000 years old are connected to them just by using creation myths or origin stories, sometimes that involve things like talking coyotes and steamboats being ridden by hares and so forth, and humans developing from the underground. And we argued that if you're going to repatriate bones, and to be clear, I'm against reburial and repatriation of all bones because I think it's a shame to lose those collections. But if you're going to do it, it should be based on science. And for that stance, that I said there's an objective truth that we can get at of whether a collection is actually connected to a modern tribe or not. For that, saying that and arguing that that is the only way we should try to make any connections by using data. And sometimes there won't be a connection because tribes have died out or have merged with other tribes. Some tribes are newer than others. But Regardless, it should be based on data and objective knowledge. And for that position, I was called a racist. And some people might argue that, what that I'm using the term woke in kind of a way that I'm not defining it. And I would say that wokeism is a part of postmodern ideology where the focus is not on just victim narrative, but on specifically race and gender narrative is the most becomes the biggest focus. And that's what woke is a postmodern ideology where sex or gender and race are the focus. So when this attempt to get my book depublished, to ban the book was occurring, I reached out to my colleagues, including my dean and my chair, to let them know what was going on. And I thought that they would be helpful. What I didn't know was as this was starting, they too started behind the scenes um, um, procedures, plans, whatever you want to call plots, schemes, whatever you want to call it, to try to get me fired. Basically, planning on giving me a bad post tenure review, um, arguing that if I taught from my own works, that they would take me out of the classroom, and so forth. Furthermore, there were other streams of events that occurred during this time in 2020. And remember, this was 2020. We were in 2021. Started like winter 2020. So then it edged into 2021. This was when we were all at home because of COVID regulations. And so a lot of this was going on online. But one of the things that happened was one of my colleagues had put out a message to all the graduate students to say, we should all be using Cite Black Authors database to ensure that we're citing Black authors. And I responded to that quite, I thought, sensitively and civilly, that although that might be well-intentioned, that I think that we should cite those authors whose work is the best and who we think has the most accurate, reconstruction of its past or understanding of a culture of its present day cultural anthropology. And for that, I was considered a racist because I was saying, we don't need to just look at one race. What we need to do is we need to divorce our research from race and look at just the best research. During this time as well, my chair and dean decided to give a talk to a group of college deans on what to do when your tenured colleague is branded a racist. And I happened to attend that online session. Not that they knew I was attending it, but I attended it. And what they basically said was that you basically have to keep these people like me, and they used a pseudonym. And it was actually quite in a way, offensive in my mind because they changed my name from Elizabeth Weiss to something like Smith. Right? Like, and I thought, this is and one of the reasons why I thought it was offensive because it's basically anglicizing the name. But the other thing is, some people in the session who were saying, well, if this person had a history of being oppressed, maybe we could have forgive this person. But kind of painting me as, well, this evil white person. And that's what giving that name also meant for them, to take away Weiss and place it with Smith. Nowadays, I think it might have made it even worse to keep my name, but we'll get back into that later. So basically, what I did as this was coming through the lines, that they were trying to keep me from teaching what I had been teaching for 17 years, is I got a lawyer. I got Pacific Legal Foundation to help represent me on these attacks on my academic freedom. There were several other uh, components to this as well. For one thing, one of the things is when we entered back into the university after our COVID restrictions, I was eager, I was chomping at the bit to get back to the skeletal collections because that's my love. I love trying to give a voice, an accurate voice to people who lived in times when they didn't have writing and couldn't tell their stories. And I want to tell their stories to the best of my ability. And so I was like very happy to get back into the collection. And I started to, do some of my curational duties. And one of the things I did was I was putting a bone into a box to unite a hand bone with the rest of the skeleton. And I looked in that box and I saw one of this skeletal remains that had a beautiful skull of a juvenile, of a young individual. And I took out the skull and I just took some photos. I was so happy. And that's that photo that you see in that first slide of me smiling because it was a genuine happy photo. And I posted that on social media saying, so happy to be back with old friends. This caused another round of concerns that I was using such a photo for promotional purposes. And some people who are not anthropologists might say, oh, well, why did you do that? What would cause you to do that? But we at the university at San Jose State and at universities across the world have used skeletal collections and our love for trying to reconstruct the past to ignite interest and curiosity. And therefore, it was one of these pictures that I thought when people see this, they too will want to be an anthropologist. And for many years at San Jose State, until that photo, um, they they basically had sometimes asked me to pose with photos for promotional photos for promotional materials like the magazine or videos. And even after that photo, it took them a couple of years to take down photos in the hallway where I had similar posings. But when I posted this photo, they acted like this was another example of my racism, holding this skull. And they once again attacked me on it based on, oh, would I have done this with a non-Native American skull? And I can say honestly, yes, I have done it with skulls from all sorts of populations, as I said, from Quebec prisoners of war to Carthage to forensic collections. This is a very common image that anthropologists use because there really is something special about trying to understand the past through bones. And, whether that is looking at Neanderthals or modern humans or Cro-Magnons, there is something that attracts people on that. It's really an intellectual endeavor. And wokeism is eroding that intellectual endeavor. Okay. There are other examples that arose throughout this time, but basically, what ended up happening was the university decided to lock me out of the curation facility, which held the collections. They decided to put new protocols in place for access to the collections. The previous protocols I had written, and those protocols that I had written emphasized the importance of keeping the skeletal collection intact, taking care that the next researcher would have equal opportunity to study a great collection. The new protocols were awash with ideological requirements that and I say they, San Jose State University administrators, such as the president, the dean, the provost, the NAGPRA coordinator and the tribal liaison said we're required to respect the bones and what came from Native American tribes. Now, the Native American tribes in the Bay Area, the Muwekma Ohlone, for example, had never complained about these images before, had even signed a memorandum of understanding that collections be uh, would be available for research, and that the only permissions that would be required would be if destructive research would be conducted. And this was in place for many years. And anytime any student from around the world or any professor from around the world wanted to do things like DNA studies, which requires destruction of bones, or isotope analysis to reconstruct the diet of these individuals, which also requires destruction, I always took the time to make sure that the correct permissions were in place. Nevertheless, the university decided to forego my simple and protective protocols to woke ideology protocols that basically shut down research. And one of the interesting things about their protocols was that it embraced some odd things, like now they wanted us to always wear masks and gloves when handling the remains. I don't know why. One of the things that was pointed out was in my photo that I wasn't wearing gloves, and wasn't this disrespectful not to wear gloves handling a skull, but actually even the federal government and National Park Service suggests not to handle remains with gloves unless these are pristine remains or forensic site or something like that, because you're more likely to drop them. So the collection that I was studying had been excavated in the 60s and 70s. They had been handled by dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals before me and during my time. And therefore, gloves was just, it was just a hoop to jump through to look like you're being more respectful. Same with masks. But the things that really bothered me with the new protocols was the sexism that they installed into these protocols, that they wrote into these protocols. For example, one of the things they said is that proper attire must be worn. Now, proper attire oftentimes means that you should that you shouldn't dress very sexy or provocative. I'm not sure that I've ever seen a anthropological researcher dress in mini skirts and high heels when doing research. But nevertheless, it is aimed at women. There is something about, like, if it's like the term appropriate attire is often aimed at women. And when I first got to San Jose State, what was interesting was that one of the professors, a cultural anthropologist, told me as an aside, she said, I rather have if I had a daughter, she didn't have children, if I had a daughter, I would rather have her wear a hijab than a miniskirt and walk around like these floozies here on campus. And I was aghast because I think that's sexist. And I said to her, I would rather live in a world where my daughter, if I had one, could wear what she wanted, rather than be told and judged by what she is wearing. And so this kind of appropriate attire really rubbed me the wrong way. But it went further than that. The third point in the protocols was that menstruating personnel, they could not even bring themselves to say women, menstruating personnel were not to handle any skeletal remains. Now, one of the things is that this is going to go into my next section about gender and sex differences. But basically, they were saying that if you're on your period, you shouldn't be touching skeletal remains. And we know from cultural anthropological research that this kind of menstrual taboo ties very closely into the concept that women are filthy when they're menstruating, that they might make men sick when they're menstruating, that this is it is a it is a shame, it's a stigma. Um, and um, Now some Native American activists are saying, oh, no, 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 it's because women are so powerful when they're menstruating. That's why they can't handle the remains. We know this is not true, that this is where the belief comes from. And even if it was, would preventing people who are on their period, preventing girls and women who are on their period from doing research is a kind of sexism. And so when they put this protocol in place, I immediately told my lawyers and I said, I think this is a Title IX issue. And they agreed. And so we threatened the university with a Title IX suit in addition to my academic freedom suit based around the fact that they were trying to fire me for being against reburial. And, um, and they removed that third protocol, menstruating personnel. But it goes further. And if you get to come to the second slide, please. So one of the things is in modern anthropology, in modern academia, the old feminism that kind of embraced that women may be different, but they're just as good, or may sometimes even better than men, has been replaced with two things. Either a sexism against women, like the menstrual taboo, or a denial of binary sex. And so when you're talking about like the menstrual taboo, I say, oh, well, that's just one thing in this whole scenario. But it's not. Field schools that come out of UC Berkeley, perhaps one of the birthplaces of feminism, now have menstrual taboos in place where if the girls and women who are engaged in the field school, so in excavation, if they're on their period, they cannot excavate, or they can't even eat with their colleagues. This is a type of sexism. And it's embraced in anthropology and in academia because what they're seeing is, oh, well, these are requirements by Native Americans. Native Americans are the oppressed group or the victims here, and therefore we must listen to them because there is no such thing as objective truth. We must take their narration as victims seriously. This has now tumbled into a denial of sex differences with the current concept of sex is not binary, the non-binary concept. And ironically, the trans women are women concept. San Jose State, as I just saw the other day, has a male on their female volleyball team. So another university with a male who is engaged in sports that is stealing the opportunity of women um, on campuses in sports with scholarships and with other, op career opportunities. And I never thought about the repatriation and reburial issue tying into the trans issue or the sex is non-binary issue, even though one of the first things you have to do as an anthropologist to study skeletal remains is identify whether the bones come from a male or female. It's basically one of the first things you learn. You actually do that before you even try to determine how old this individual was when they died, because of course females mature slightly faster than males, and this is true in the bones as well. So we need to know the sex before we need to know the age. And so in 2022 or 2023, I was asked to be on a panel for the American Anthropological Association that dealt with this issue of sex as an important category to study in anthropology, and specifically male female sex as binary. And this panel had, I believe it had 5 women, and we were from 3 different continents, spoke 3 different languages. We had a physical anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, those concerned about women's rights, and just, it was quite a diverse panel in the sense of we were looking at this issue from all different perspectives. My own perspective was that looking at the skeleton, and the title of my talk was "Make No Bones About It: Skeletal Sex is Binary. People may not be." And so what I did through that talk, or what I had planned to do at the talk, and I'll get back to when that talk actually happened, but when I wrote it out as, this is how we know if a skeleton comes from a male and female or female, and these are the ways why sex is still important in forensics and medicine and so forth. But in forensic anthropology, so the study of people who recently passed away, like in criminal settings, we may also want to be aware that there are people who are identifying as a woman or a man when they're not biologically that. And are there ways that we can find out if what somebody's biological sex is and how somebody identified? And most specifically, like looking at feminization surgery. The surgery alters bones. So you would think that a forensic anthropologist may be able to utilize that information to determine whether this person was born a female or a male, and it's mainly male, so want to look to be female with the surgery. The masculine surgery is not really a thing with the bones. So I that's where my talk was going. So I actually thought it was quite a politically correct and generous talk, because I was talking, yes, sex is binary, but no, we should not discriminate against people who are transgender. And we actually, forensic anthropologists, need to understand both and try to solve these problems. But that was not good enough. And basically, the whole panel was canceled. And they canceled it because, again, they called us racists and sexists and eugenicists, and said that our position was anti-trans or transphobic. Well, I totally deny that, of course. And yet, even though we had tried to make the argument that they were incorrect and responded to it, it made headlines around the world. It made the New York Times, and the panel was canceled. We did hold the panel online through Heterodox Academy, which was great because they saved the panel in one way, but in another way, it would have been so much better to be in person with these other academics, fielding questions from academics who disagreed with us, and taking those on and seeing where there's disagreement, where there's agreement, and who, learning from one another. That's what anthropology and academia is about. But wokeism has basically said that there is no room for debate. The science is settled, and we will not converse with you. And so that was another aspect of this kind of issue in anthropology that has obviously creeped out of anthropology and into other realms, including going out of academia altogether. We saw the horrendous showing of male strength in the Olympics with the boxers is another example. I also think it's important to remember that, the changes that occur as a result of the transitioning can have seriously negative effects on people's bone health, and that this is also not something that anthropologists are willing to engage in. And that was another part of my talk. I will take the next slide, please. One of the things that we might think of is, how did we get here? How did we get to a field that was so interested in studying others, which is what anthropology does? It looks at, the other and tries to understand them from a biological, cultural, social viewpoint, and trying to understand the past, to putting our own view and our own identities onto the past. And I call this the new tribes of anthropology, but it can also be the new tribes of academia. And what we have is anthropology in particular has splintered into these new tribes like queers for queer archaeology, the Black trowel movement, the Latinx anthropologists, and so forth, to try to make the argument that their identity is something that is natural and normal and can be seen in other places. And that if you don't see it in other places, it's basically because white colonialists have erased that identity. The clearest picture here is when you look at queers for archaeology through a queer lens, or queer lenses of archaeology, where they try to reconstruct the past and make arguments that past people were trans or were non-binary because they had an artifact that was maybe not associated with what we would consider their sex. So, for example, if a female is found with an arrowhead, and my position is that they're putting the dependent variable, the artifact, as an independent variable, and they're forgetting that the independent variable is sex. And they're doing so to make the argument, well, see, if I'm trans now, then trans people must have existed in the past, and therefore it's normal. And the only reason why there's any argument about it is because whites came in and destroyed these kind of diverse cultures. But that's not what we find. What we find is that many of these things, whether it's Queers for Palestine, or whether it is a emphasis on robotic human sex relationships, what we find is that this is all new. And what we have to figure out is why things have changed, but we don't want to put our lens onto the past. And the other part of why they're doing this is because they're filtering it through the postmodern lens of there is no objective truth. So when you find a skeleton, whether it's a male or female, is no longer an objective truth, for example. And that the only importance is that you're listening to the oppressor. And that's how we get to basically what we find in modern academia. I think it's kind of interesting in California when they started to require ethnic studies in this California State University, and moving it into the high schools. What was interesting is that they included in ethnic studies in Native Americans, Hispanics, African Americans, Middle Easterners, but they did not include Jewish studies. That was not considered a part of ethnic studies in requirement. And it's because just like in the other, just like with anthropology in general, the academia has embraced that narrative that basically the Muslims, the Middle Eastern Muslims, are the oppressed, and therefore they are the victims, and therefore their narrative is what counts. And you cannot have then a non, you can't, you need to find those who oppress them, and they will say, well, obviously, then those would be the Jewish people. And so actually, Jewish groups have been um, have been joined with white Europeans as the oppressors, and then the Muslims have been joined with the people of color as the oppressed. And as politics makes strange bedfellows, that's why now you see things like Queers for Palestine or Fatties for Palestine, because these are the oppressed tribes coming together and arguing against the oppressors. And of course, this narrative of oppressed and oppressors is a false narrative. It does not take into account that in all time, all people at some time have been oppressors and oppressed. And that things, if you look at the history of slavery, for example, it's horrendous that slavery occurred and occurs. What's remarkable is that humans have been able to eradicate slavery to a great extent. There is still slavery, I'm not saying that there isn't, but it used to be worldwide. From the Haida in British Columbia, the Native Americans um, uh, on the northwest coast engaged in slavery, to the uh, Floridian um, Native Americans were engaged in slavery before contact, to the Arab slave trade. And slavery was basically a worldwide issue until it was eradicated for the most part by colonialization, European colonialization, for example. So this is not to cast blame at anybody, but rather to say the bigger human picture is that we shouldn't try to find out who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor, but rather find out how we can help humanity as a whole, whether that is, looking at an accurate reconstruction of the past, or whether that is, looking at how we can best identify a crime victim using their bones. There are other absurdities, and I'll take the next slide, please. So one of the things is that a lot of these issues are about what's going on today, but they also hinder our ability to do research, as I started off with. And so we get these myths taking hold, whether those are myths in cultural anthropology or physical anthropology. In physical anthropology, the myths become that Native Americans were not violent and that violence only started upon European contact. And we could see in the skull has an obsidian flake, and this was from this collection that I studied, all pre-contact. There was a massive amount of violence in pre-contact America. That's not to say that there wasn't violence in the old world. Of course there was, but it's about understanding humanity as opposed to drawing a saintly picture of some people in the past and a overly demonic picture of others. And then more absurdities, such as this rock that has been considered now sacred at San Jose State. It creeps out from the university into other places. For example, I just spent a year in New York looking at museums, and what I found was that museums are engaged in this type of absurdity to telling women, for example, that they should not handle any artifacts made with hair because it might harm them because they're weaker, hiding pictures, photographs of skulls, having electronic databases that won't show images of artifacts from the Ibu of Africa because those masks are not to be seen by women. This absurdity has left the university and is in all our lives now. And that's one of the reasons why we need to be aware of it. Um, I think I have one more slide, maybe two more slides, but next slide, please. Yes. So one of the interesting things is that all these issues about postmodernism has been bubbling away for decades now. But on October 7th, we see it explode onto the screen with our campus protests and the protests for the anti-Israeli protests about basically, you know, the free Palestine protests, so forth. Again, viewing the Palestinians as the victims, as the oppressed, and the Israelis as the oppressors. I think it's interesting how when this happened, when October 7th happened, when we saw several aspects on campus that we should have been aware of, and that was bubbling away. One thing is that um, academic freedom and free speech has been under attack for decades at the universities, and yet there was no way for university presidents. Of course, we saw the horrendous performance from the Ivy League presidents in front of Congress. Um, there's no way for them to say, you know, we condemn these protests or talk about how to deal with these protests. Um, and they fell back on, oh, it's about academic freedom and freedom of speech. Yet for years, they had been attacking others for, for their speech and for their academic positions. And I would say the other thing is that those protests showed a hypocrisy in the sense of we've been told that, you know, silence is violence, so you have to speak up, and also violence is violence, so you sometimes you know you're supposed to stay quiet. But what they don't, you know, when these were occurring and I was talking to people, one thing is that I was told over and over again as well, no violence has occurred. This is no violence has occurred. And at the beginning, that might have been true. But I would say that there's a difference between different protests. There's a peaceful protest that's nonviolent, a peaceful protest, a peaceful protest that's nonviolent, a nonviolent protest that is not peaceful, and a violent protest, which is also not peaceful. And nobody wanted to admit that these were not peaceful protests, but rather they were non-peaceful protests. And that this resulted in things like vandalism, stopping students from getting to class, stopping students from being able to study, um, you know, intimidation. Before anything violent happened, this should have been stopped because they were not peaceful protests. And yet, I guarantee you, if it had been the other way around, those protests for for the Israelis, they would have been stopped. But because the Palestinians and the Middle Easterners were seen as oppressed, they could not be touched. And so I think that this is the epitome of the wokeness. It doesn't matter who is telling the more accurate story. It doesn't matter who is being more civil or more peaceful. All what matters is the victim narrative. And so that is what I saw occurring on, on campus. I think that we would see that basically this kind of activity would is going to continue until we grapple with going back to a movement of objective knowledge and not looking at just who the narrator is, but rather trying to understand the facts, trying to engage in civil debate, and getting to the bottom of how to save anthropology and academia. Now, personally, I think that anthropology might be too far gone. And that's one, that's a real shame because anthropology is like, a wonderful field and really is helpful in so many ways, from medicine to forensic to just understanding each other. But I think it's too far gone because what we basically have is we have laws that are requiring the reburial of collections. So the collections are gone. Um, we have professors who are arguing that even more remains should be removed, including remains such as from the East Indian bone trade that is in the teaching collections, but also the the journals are now not allowing photographs of skeletal remains and certain artifacts. And there's no pushback. Nobody is saying, hold on, let's not rebury these remains. Hold on, let's not destroy that cast. And so I don't know if anthropology can be saved, but I am hopeful that academia can be. And then I'll take my last slide again to promote my book. Um, so after my lawsuit at San Jose State University, um, I settled the case, and that settlement allowed me to retire early and also spend, before my retirement, spend a year in New York with Heterodox Academy's Center for Academic Freedom, academic pluralism, excuse me. And what I did during that time is I did a lot of work in museums, looking at a lot of museums, writing about it. But I also wrote my memoir, On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. And this book is, is the tale of my cancellations, starting from repatriation and erasing the past to the, the AAA sex cancellation, and but it also dives into how these things are interconnected with the university and how and woke culture and how basically this is then creeps out into the world beyond academia. So that is my talk. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing questions.
So I have a couple of questions for you. Uh, First, this one, which is very tricky, but I think you'll enjoy it. Can you explain why some athletes are not trans but still male and competing in female sports? Is this because sex is non-binary?
Thanks. That's a great question. Basically, one of the confusions about, the Olympics just happened, one of the confusions about the Olympic boxers who were male but not trans was, people saying, oh, they're trans. And other people saying, no, 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 they're not trans. They have chromosomal disorders or biological aspect that makes them female, but with some male characteristics. Well, there are people who are born with what we call disorders of sexual development, and that usually is a so usually you have an XX chromosome and an XY chromosome, and XY is male and XX is female on the 23rd pair, your last pair of chromosomes. And sometimes you can have an XYY or XXY. And so this is a chromosomal disorder. And so you'll have basically people who don't neatly fit into male, female from first look, like from birth. But their pathologies are not normal variations. And actually, they're still male or female because it's not just the chromosomes that determine the sex, it's whether that individual would be producing ovum or sperm. And the boxers, for example, both of those boxers who were boxed as females who were really male, they had probably some genetic disorder, chromosomal or genetic disorder, but they were males who just were not perfect males. And one of the things that I like to point out is that, we have pathologies of all sorts, diseases and congenital birth defects of all sorts, and yet we wouldn't consider that normal. Um, it's not bad to say something is pathological or diseased, it's just a fact. So some people, for example, are born with 6 fingers. We wouldn't say, oh, well, the average hand has 5 to 6 fingers. We'd say, well, that's a pathology, and usually we correct it by removing the extra finger. um, and so I would say that these individuals, sometimes it can be confusing, but sex identification tests, including those that those boxers took and failed before, would have resolved that issue, and they should have boxed with males.
I have another one for you. So, uh, doesn't introducing Native American or indigenous knowledge help us understand the past? So that would be a kind of counter argument to what you've said.
Right. So one of the things is that recently the concept of indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge has been added into reburial laws like NAGPRA, but also the Biden administration, for example, has an indigenous knowledge mandate, which requires adding indigenous knowledge into all sorts of fields. And New Zealand has an indigenous knowledge component in its, and so does Australia, I believe, and Canada. And some people have argued that adding indigenous knowledge into the field, whether it's anthropology or astronomy, um, helps us understand the past or present, or gives us another avenue of understanding. But the thing is that there is no such thing as indigenous knowledge, just like there is no such thing as European knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge. And so as long as that knowledge as long as we're able to test that knowledge objectively, then I would say that's okay. But the problem with indigenous knowledge is that in the US, for example, it is literally written that it's considered expert um, testimony and is not to be questioned. And even if one tribe's indigenous knowledge conflicts with another tribe's indigenous knowledge, there's no way to say, well, this tribe is right and that tribe is wrong, even if they're talking about the same plot of land, for example. And this is a movement away from objective knowledge, from trying to get down to the truth. I view science as a search for the truth, even though we may never get to it, but we're always trying to get to the most accurate understanding. And any knowledge that cannot be questioned is not going to help that.
A third one now. Oh, this one is interesting. How does political correctness differ from wokeness?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question. So I'm from California. I'm actually from San Francisco. So I grew up, I spent my high school years in San Francisco. I'm actually grew up many places, but I spent my high school years in San Francisco. And I went to University of California, Santa Cruz, which was probably the most politically correct university that you could go to. Um, their mascot, they had no sports, and their mascot was the banana slug. So it was a very out there university. And one of the things is I noticed political correctness throughout, but and I think that political correctness and wokeness are related in that um, they they're both tied to the postmodern belief of victim narratives. But I think wokeness takes it to another level where it's very clear that it's about race and gender, whereas political correctness can be more about any kind of, can include more uh, more groups. But also, I think political correctness in some ways was more tied to not wanting to hurt feelings than wokeness. I I know we still have that, the issue of, do no harm, words can hurt and so forth, in wokeness. But I think that in some ways, wokeness can be quite mean. As long as it's coming from the oppressed, the meanness is fine. But I think political correctness was a little softer and was basically like, you know what, we don't want to hurt people, we don't want to offend people. It was more about just being non-offensive. That's my take. Now, some people may disagree with me, but that's basically how I see the difference.
Okay, that's very interesting. So question number 4, why should those outside of academia be concerned about wokeness? So the rest of us, basically.
Right, right. So, one of the things is that there's a saying that we're all on campus now. And I think that that is quite true in the sense that when whatever is taught in universities leaves the universities and and pervades society. So, for example, when a student learns how to be a teacher at universities and they are indoctrinated in wokeness, and especially, with ethnic studies being very key, then they're going to take what they've learned, whether it is, that, you know, Muslims are the oppressed and Jews are the oppressors, or whether it is, decolonization of the sciences and we must listen to the indigenous knowledge. They're going to take that indoctrination into your child's classroom and teach your child that way. So then it becomes the next generation. The other aspect of it is that basically, sorry about that. Sorry about that. Basically, what we're going to have is also in medicine, doctors, nurses are not being taught anymore about things like sex differences. And therefore, what we're going to have is we're going to have an issue of, you know, a gynecologist who is not properly trained to deal with female issues. Or we're going to have a doctor who's much more worried about the race of a person than about treating them in the best possible manner. I think one interesting example is um, there are there are differences in maturation rates with different populations, and even in utero, there's differences in maturation rates. And when when some of the first African immigrants came to France, you know, as the French colonies were decolonized, and then you also had the African immigrants coming into France. Um, some doctors were not aware of this kind of human variation, normal human variation, and they started to induce labor they started to stop labor of African women who were full term, but basically their children matured just a little bit faster, and there was actually an increase in um, in stillborns and in pregnancy complications because of that. We need to know the differences of sex, of different populations, to be able to best help them. And if you're worried that mentioning those differences is going to brand you a racist, then you may not address those, and that's going to creep out from the university. I think that it's just going to pervade everywhere, whether it is medicine, your schools, forensic anthropology. Do we really want to go to a system where when a skeleton is found, we say, well, we can't be sure whether this is male or female until we do perhaps a DNA test or a slew of tests, or even talk to people because they might have identified differently, when it takes 5 seconds or 2 minutes to identify whether skeletal remains are male or female. And that can start the process of answering the question of who this poor deceased individual was. So it will leave the university and enter into all of these realms.
Question number 5 now. Oh, this one is, where do we go from here? Is there hope for anthropology specifically and the university in general? So you've addressed
Right.
this issue already, but maybe you can dwell a little bit on it.
Yeah, I do, I am very skeptical of the hope for anthropology, as I mentioned. Now, anthropology does have various fields. So, I'm a physical anthropologist, dealing with skeletal remains. So my area is probably more under attack than other areas. Um, but I think that is very problematic to have these fields buried. Um, I think there may be hope for academia. There are some new universities opening up that might be hopeful, like the University of Austin. What I don't see in these new places is hands-on fields like anthropology, archaeology, geology. They're more philosophical and maybe some computer and maths, but we also need those fields that require materials. And I hope that new universities are going to be able to tackle that question. How do we get into a new university, for example, resources to start, for example, a forensic collection to do forensic research? And I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. I do
So,
think that there's going to be some backlash against the wokeness, and so maybe next generation will be less woke, and that might also have a little bit of a positive effect on universities.
so I'll merge two questions, but it's on the
Okay.
same topic. Do you know about colleagues who face the same problems, who censor themselves? And what about the students? I mean, do the students
Right.
have expressed support for your work or your approach or?
I actually have experienced a lot of support. One of the misconceptions is that when you're being canceled, that nobody supports you, and that's not true. I've had a lot of support, a lot from other professors who are being canceled, unfortunately. That goes to show you how big of a problem it is. You have your own professors in Canada, like Francis Widdowson, who's been fired. Um, and Kathleen Lowry, who was on the panel with me in the American Anthropological Association panel with me. So there are definitely others who are facing the same issue, and there are those who, you know, come up to me quietly or send me an email and say, "Don't use my name, but I'm really supportive of you. Don't let anybody know, but I'm on your side." This makes me sad because I think the worst thing is having to hide what your thoughts are. We're academics. Our mind is our life, right? And in a sense, if you have to censor your perspective to keep your job, then we're losing a battle. One of the things that happened to me very early on, and actually when the Cite Black Authors case issue came around, is a former student of mine sent me an email saying, I thought about, and she worked in the university as well. She said, I I thought really long and hard about whether I should send this email to you from my university account or from my private account. And I decided to send it from my private account. And she said, you know, I know you're not a racist. I think it's terrible how you're being treated. And this was a student who was she was a Hispanic student. And so, it made me happy that she reached out to me, but it made me sad that she was concerned enough to worry about what email she was sending it to. I guarantee you that was the first time she ever thought, should I send this email from my university, or should I send it from a private to another colleague, really? So um, so there are people who are on my side, some of them vocal, some of them not. But the thing is, when people see a cancellation occurring, they don't want to be the next one. And that keeps people silent. I have to say, you know, I'm going to plug my book on the warpath. Um, if you read it, you'll see that even though what happened to me and to the field is horrendous, there were many times where, you know, I had to laugh out loud because of the absurdity, such as when one of my colleagues said that I should get consent from the people that I was going to photograph, even though these people had died, in the 6th century AD, before photography was even invented. She knew that, but she was just kind of being, I would think facetious. Uh, she was either being facetious or she was incredibly dumb, and I didn't think she was dumb. But you have to laugh at this because when absurdity strikes, there is no other answer. And so I think that was one of the things that I took away from that. But the other thing is that throughout the whole time, and the first time the cancellation started was in the end of 2020. It was literally days before Christmas. I was on Christmas break or winter break, and so it was literally before that, like maybe on the 22nd or 21st of December. And also, and it went on till just last November or so, was one of the last times I was that a cancellation attack was lodged at me, so to speak. But like one of the things was that throughout all this time, I remember that there are people on my side, that I have to speak up, but also that when there's something funny, you gotta laugh at it. And through all that time, I never had a sleepless night because of it. And I laughed many more tears. I cried many more tears of laughter than tears of sorrow. And so I think that that's an important thing to remember, that even though it's horrendous, you can handle it. And if you can handle it, it is actually our duty to stand up for the science and for academia as anthropologists, as scholars. And so, with that being said, make sure you get legal representation if somebody's after you. And I can't thank Pacific Legal Foundation enough for the job they did representing me.
So because we're running out of time, I'll merge many questions and I'll ask them all
Okay.
together. So we have a lot of people who ask us, how can you either save this? Well, you've already kind of answered this, but is there something that can either replace or compete with academia? And how can you save your field from, I would say, from this from the yoke of wokeness? Also, we've had other questions. One asks you, for example, and this is very interesting, do anthropologists ha do anthropologists have any century boundary, for example, 1900, that define when it is not appropriate to further dig up a group of skeletons found at a burial site? Another one, this one is funny, but when you talk to LGBT pro-Hamas groups, how do they justify this kind of their support for people who want to have them dead? And and I think that's more or less that's
Okay,
about
so let
it.
me
Yeah.
answer
So
those.
I'll have maybe one question of my own, and this is really something that I wanted
Okay.
to ask for a long time. where does this, I would say, funny idea that racism and colonialism is a white invention comes from? So I think we have enough to wrap it
Okay,
up.
so I'll answer some of those questions. So first thing is, I want to say like where, how can we save the field? Where can we go? What are other alternatives? And I would say private funding would be uh, if we can get completely private universities, private organizations, museums that take no federal funding, no money from the government, that is the only way you can deal with in anthropology with continuing collections, I think. And so I hope that somebody listening will say, wow, okay, I'll start my own museum and we'll start get on it. The National Association of Scholars, I'm a board member of them, they have a series about science and about taking science out, federal funding out of science and how science can be privately funded. And so I do think that that is one possibility. And there are billionaires who want to fund things. So, maybe they can, put some money towards anthropology. Um, so the other question was about the date of the excavations. Most excavations are what we call salvage sites. And these are sites that are excavated because there's construction. And so like if a road is being built. And so the option is you either bulldoze the site or you excavate it. That's almost all collections in Canada and the US and in Europe. So that's most collections. There's, if a place is a cemetery, then usually there's no excavation on that. There are exceptions. In Europe, they excavate cemeteries all the time for for space. And then they hold remains in conservatories. Now, some of those are even now being reburied. I I think that there's debate whether the timeline, but in the past, the concept has been about, you know, is there somebody who's still living related to those individuals? So looking at time like 100 years or so. But there's no steady rule about it. But most collections are literally, they're going to build up a building there and they find it and then they excavate it because the only other option is to destroy it. And so those are the collections that I've mainly worked with. The other collections I've worked with were forensic collections with body donations. So, so then the other question was about how can you marry things like queers for Palestine? How what do those people think when they I spent a year in I lived for a year in Egypt and and one of the interesting things was I knew a few students who were foreign exchange students like myself um, who literally could not find a home for like housing because they were Jewish. Now, people might say, well, Weiss is a Jewish name. And on um, my father's side is Jewish, but my mother's side is German. But the interesting thing was in Egypt, they didn't realize that Weiss was a Jewish name. I think that had they realized it, I would have been treated very differently because I know some students went back because they literally, nobody would rent an apartment to them, you know. Um, I think those people who are, queers for Palestine, so forth, they're just in denial and they do not believe the, they do not believe that the how anti um, homos I don't like the term phobic because actually don't think it's phobic. I think it's hatred. So anti-homosexual, most of the Middle East is. I a professor, a colleague of mine, once said, in the middle, he's Jewish, Jewish professor who was also professor of the Jewish club at the university, and he also was a history professor, military studies. And he said, how a progressive, and I'm not saying this for every Middle Easterner, of course I'm not, or every Muslim, but in general, the ethos, the culture, is that a progressive Muslim is for women's rights and against Jews. And a non-progressive Muslim is against women's rights and against Jews, And I think that some of this has some kernel of truth in it. Of course it does. And I think that those people who think that they're going to be embraced by, or if they go to Palestine by Hamas and they're homosexual or they're trans, if they went, they would be wrong, severely mistreated, if not killed, and they just have blinders on. So, what was the last question?
So the last question was because I put it
It
all
was your
together.
question, I know.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was my question. Yes, where does this crazy idea or funny idea that racism and colonialism and slavery is a white
Right.
invention come from? I had professors who said that in class, and I was taken aback. So
I think it does come from this postmodern agenda that is basically split the world into the oppressors and the oppressed. And this is mainly it started before the 60s, but it really hit a stride in the 60s. And you get these works like Howard Zinn's History of the People that perpetuate this. And it's a kind of, and in some ways, I think that some of these postmodernists, they don't even believe it themselves, but it doesn't matter because it's not about truth. It's not about an objective truth. It's about trying to change the world perspective of let's focus on victim narrative. And so, even if the victim is lying, that doesn't matter. It matters that it's a victim telling the story. And so that's why I think that's where I think it comes from. It's an abandonment of looking for truth.
I think now it's time for Doris to wrap it up.
Let me just say something
Yes.
very quickly. If people do want to send me their questions, I am more than happy to answer emails and answer questions via email. And my email address is elizabeth.weiss@sjsu.edu. So elizabeth.weiss@sjsu.edu.
Dr. Weiss, let me
Thank
read
you.
you what one of our viewers just wrote in. Thank you for a wonderful talk. You're courageous and are not afraid to defend truth. It's an inspiration to us all. I want to thank you for a unique insider look at what's going on in our universities in Canada, in the United States, and how you pointed out how it's infecting society. We all have to be woke warriors, and thank you for being one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bernard Bobo, thank you for your insightful questions.
Thank you.
And everybody, this was the first in our series of Can Our Universities Be Saved? This was the first one. Watch out for the next one. It's coming soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Bye, everybody.